Hello everyone, I am Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie. I found my camcorder, so now we're in a situation where I can be recording again, and yet ironically for wanting that camcorder so much, I'm now using a camcorder on, a webcam instead. Oh well, that's how these things go sometimes. But anyway, so I had an interesting comment today, which was someone was asking, and let me go to my game while we're discussing, someone was asking me about whether people were finding it an easier time to use two-handed swords or one-handed swords during test cutting, which is an interesting thing to think about actually, because when you're doing test cutting, it condenses the fighting pretty much down to like a video game, speaking of video games, like a damage per second type of thing, just looking at how much physical damage or injury you can create on a target in the littlest amount of time, and how easy it is to perform that task. Now, I should mention first off, they were doing this comment on a video about, from Swords and Cider, which is an event run by the Historical European Martial Arts Club called the Iron Door Collective. Now, I should mention first off that there is a contaminating factor in this, if you thought of it as a science experiment, that the club mostly does long swords. That means they are using swords in two hands. So you'll have several people, you'll have outsiders and some people who've never done this stuff before attending the event, but a majority of the attendants are from the club itself, and it means that when they are attending, they are coming from an experience distinctly in longsword. So yes, first off, I should just say that the people who were in the event are from a longsword background, so yeah, of course they like longsword more. They used swords in two hands more frequently than in one hand, so yes, their operations of swords in two hands over one hand is natural from that. However, there is a degree to which there is a universal enjoyment of sword in two hands instead of sword in one hand. This is for a few reasons. Now, firstly, it's a bigger sword. So, yes, the weight can come into factor. If you've got a bigger sword, it's got more sort of oomph to it. Even though it is a sharp weapon, the fact that it has more presence can allow it to do more injury. And thus, if you're applying that to a sharp blade, even though, yes, a decently sharp blade should be able to cut without being heavy, without being a painful blade to use, there is still the fact that having some weight to it will help in that leverage. And it's not, a different type of leverage, because it's still a sword, so overall the dynamics, it's not like you're comparing axes with swords, it's not like you're comparing spears with swords, you're still looking at swords versus swords in terms of what is easier. So yeah, the bigger sword is something that'll do more damage. But that's actually more of a minor factor, believe it or not. Somewhat tiny by comparison. One of the things that really helps, and I mean really helps, is the leverage, which is something that is special in two hands. It's much easier to do so than if you're using a one-handed sword. So let me go to face only. Sorry, it's my ugly face. So, I've got this sword here. This is one that I'm repairing, but this is an example of a two-handed sword. Excuse me, even though it's a blunt training one. But when you're performing a cut, there is the leverage where you're pushing forwards with your top hand and pulling back with your bottom hand. When I'm explaining this to beginners about how to operate a sword, how to perform a decent cut, I describe it as being like casting a fishing rod. So I'm doing that. So I'm starting from my ready position and like I'm casting out a line. Now, this is an easier cut for someone to understand, and it's something you can pretty much teach within one sort of learning session. They can get into it fairly quickly because it's more of your natural body motion. So you've got I'd say three, apart from your movement with the rest of your body, in terms of your arm action, because you're in a real fight, your body can be all over the place. You're moving forwards, backwards, you're maneuvering around your opponent, you're getting different angles, things like that. But in something like test cutting, where you're just taking, you know, something like standing still or taking a step forward and then performing your action, it's doesn't change that much, apart from those two. Either you're in the spot or you're on... Whoops, I'm not middle fingering you. Or you're going towards a target with usually just a step. Something like a passing step or a lunge. Passing step being like walking, you know, I'm putting one foot in front of the other, and a lunge being the same foot that's already forward, I'm extending forward, like sport fencers do. But when I'm doing a cut, you've got the action from the shoulder. So I'm going here, I'm trying not to hit the ceiling or the light. This, it's like an action figure. Now, pretty much with zero training, people do this fine. Absolutely fine. They've got their their shoulder going and bring the blade in the direction they want. Obviously I'm going up, down, but this can apply in any direction, wherever you're rotating that shoulder or other parts of your body. And that's fine. Then you've got from the elbow, so that's going, whoop, mustn't use my wrist, I'm going here. So this, ooh, I'm knocking my light, brilliant. I'm going to keep that take. Operating from the good grief. Operating, I'm going to have to do it diagonally. Operating from the elbow, this is something that people tend to get fairly right without any training, but sometimes they need a little bit of a guidance, just a few tips just to make sure to use that bit of the elbow properly for a decent cut, but very little training required. Most beginners can basically be okay with it. Now, the wrist. This is where they struggle. So, if I have my arm locked straight like this, and my cut is like that, see that? You can see there is some rotation, there is some force happening, and you can imagine what's happening at the tip. When I'm using a sword in two hands, I can get away with less of that wrist motion because I'm just doing that casting motion. It's kind of like you're just sort of punching something. Punching forwards with one hand and not doing as much with your bottom hand, or in some cases you're kind of leveraging and pulling that bottom hand backwards in this sort of motion, which is easier to understand. It's more of a natural motion for people who've never had any sword training. Now, I've ended up with arms a bit closer to sort of Popeye's. If you remember Popeye the Sailor Man, he's a weird guy who's got very, very large forearms and tiny biceps. Now, the way you can end up having a bit of this happening in real life, so I've picked up this Langsax that I forged, the newer one, and as you can see, when I am cutting one-handed, this motion here requires more of the wrist. Now, yes, obviously you're doing your full arm. I don't have a huge amount of room, but you can kind of see if I'm doing a decent cut, I'm using my shoulders, my elbow, and my wrist. All of these combine for a decent quality cut. So when you're a beginner and you're using a one-handed sword for test cutting, it's more difficult because you're having to consciously think about using your wrist to rotate and operate the sword. Whereas, when you're operating a two-handed sword, you can almost forget about it. Even though it does offer some advantages if you learn about things like the squinting cut, which is, you don't need to know about it, but it's a particular type of two-handed sword cut where you're sort of leveraging over, leveraging over your... In fact, what am I doing? I've got my face here. Right. So, that is where you're leveraging over like that, and especially I find works great for people who are tall people, and they can leverage over. So if you've got a defense, you can leverage over and catch the person despite their parry, and other actions like that. It's useful for different things, but actions like that do use the wrist more, but a normal sort of basic cut you can get away with. Face and screen, here we are. You can use the face and screen, I'm thinking of my buttons. You can use the wrist a lot less of a normal basic cut, which makes it a lot easier. But yeah, so it's... Let's see how this goes. Before it deployed, fantastic. Right, so when you're operating a one-handed sword versus two-handed sword, yeah, that's one of my points. It's more difficult, just the physical leverage. But apart from that, a one-handed sword has more leverage from its length. Now, people think of heavy swords do more damage, but actually, one of the things that has a greater effect is longer swords do more damage. This is something you notice, and I've noticed it with some of the blades I've made, because I'm newer to bladesmithing. My blades tend to be a bit shorter, so we're talking sort of approximately typically around a 20-inch blade, which is a bit short for a sword. Usually it tend to be at least, I think Gladius was historically something like a 24-inch blade, and something like an arming sword would be something more like 27 inches. Actual results may vary wildly, but still, something like a long sword, as in a sword in two hands, you can have blades, you know, with a one-handed sword, you could get something like, excuse me, a cavalry saber, which will be something like a bit over 30 inches blade. Juicy cutting. Very nice. Which don't even have to be that heavy. They just have that leverage and then nice juicy cutting action. But there's a limit before it starts to get overbearing, and in fact can make those swords feel heavier because they've not gained much weight. But it's that thing, it's like if you hold a sledgehammer or a heavy hammer like that, or, you know, heavy axe, you'll find if you hold it near the head, you can carry it all day long. But if you held it out extended in your arm, you'd find your arm is, you know, completely out and extended. Your arm's dropping after a time. It's because of the leverage. And the same sort of thing applies to the cutting mechanics. The more there's a blade length, the more of a cutting dynamic it provides for the same weight. It's one of the things I've also found with... I did in a previous video, and I was talking about leverage mechanics in using things like warhammers and other blunt weapons. So I got got a ball peen hammer, a couple of pounds, struck a construction helmet. Didn't seem to do much. Then I got a club hammer, double the weight, 4 pounds. Ooh, hit the helmet. Seemed to have a bit of a... seemed to impact it, but didn't really do anything to damage it. But then I got a ball peen hammer head, just a couple of pounds, on the end of a long stick I collected from the woods because I live next to some woodlands. And then operated that, it practically exploded the helmet. That is the power of leverage. It was a couple of pounds hammer. Yes, the stick would have added some weight, but not much. It wasn't a very heavy stick. But yet, that extra leverage where I was able to power it with those two hands and slam that thing down, just broke the thing. And that is something you can experience in things like test cutting. You will normally have a better time cutting with a longer blade, even for the same weight, which is an interesting feature. In fact, I've found that sometimes you get knife makers who make quite heavy blades in knives, and yes, it does improve the cutting mechanics, and yet I can quite easily, like I had a lightweight falcata, that blade I produced, and that was... I don't think it was it was something ridiculously light. It was barely a pound in weight, so quite a lightweight blade, and yet the cutting that it could produce was quite nice. And again, that's because it was only a 19-inch blade, but that was long enough that it produced a good strong cutting mechanic, which is one of the really useful things about two-handed swords, because of course when they get longer, firstly, they start to physically gain weight, so you're not thinning it out and making it risk snapping or bending. But also, just in general, it physically will, for the same weight, feel heavier anyway. So that combines, so you need both hands to operate the sword. So you've got that lovely cutting action, but in response, you do need to have both hands so you can manage it without it being unwieldy. Of course, in test cutting, you're not worrying about having to operate, say, a pistol or, you know, revolver with your saber, or something like a dagger with your hatchet, or something like a shield with your sword. It's test cutting. you're not defending yourself. So maximum damage, go for it, buddy. Hence, two-handed swords are quite preferable, even for people who don't normally use two-handed swords. So it is quite useful for that stuff. What else? Yeah, I mean, so those sorts of dynamics combine. So another thing that tends to happen is also one of the things that makes, conversely, one-handed swords tend to be quite nice is that if you're looking at historical examples, I mean, of course there'll be people who make ahistorical sort of, you know, do what you like, or sometimes things like the what's it called, Kriegsmesser. If you've ever seen the Scalagrim channel, he's got this big two-handed falchion-like blade that's one single-edged, sort of machete-like, really good chopper. But your typical historical two-handed swords tend to be of a late medieval design. Now this actually makes them worse for cutting because they tend to have finer points, because historically those sorts of swords were designed to operate against armor, and no, you shouldn't try to cut through armor because that's just going to dull your blade and you're probably going to get cut apart or smashed to pieces or something while you're trying. What ends up happening instead is when you're using a long sword, you know, two-handed sword against armor, you're operating it usually in half sword, which is grey. Grab the blade about halfway up and you're looking for gaps in the armor. Now my point being here that if you're using those more historically accurate two-handed swords, they tend to have not too bad of a cutting dynamic, but they're a bit, I find they tend to be worse in cutting towards the tip. So that actually means that a lot of people, when they're cutting, especially when they lack confidence, they tend to undershoot or overshoot. And then when they correct themselves, they tend to go from undershooting to overshooting more frequently. Which means that their cuts aren't awful, it's just that those cuts are more towards the tip. Now with a sword that is more of a fine pointed blade, which is something that happens more frequently with a two-handed sword, European style anyway, that's another caveat, it does tend to mean that you get actually better results, despite what I've just said, to some extent with one-handed swords. But with the two-handed swords of designs such as the Kriegsmesser or something like a Japanese katana, obviously that will change. So that's worth bearing in mind. You know, a lot of these factors will vary depending on individual results. I'm trying to talk more sort of broadly. But with things like a katana or a Kriegsmesser or something, yeah, when they've got that tip weight, that helps. And that is something that you'll find across the one-handed swords and the two-handed swords. Now, in terms of stabbing, because I've talked a lot about cutting, and I realise I've not been giving any love to the thrusting blades, which sounds like something that'd be weird to say out of context. Anyway, but when you're using thrusting blades, they tend to be, I'd say, easier one-handed for the sake of just sort of accuracy, but they tend to be more fun because fun is an important factor here. It's not just, I suppose, pure damage. There is an important factor of the fun of just the experience is definitely had when you're using a two-handed sword, because when you run through a target like a water bottle, you're running along an extra length of blade, which is so much fun. When you're using a one-handed sword or a two-handed sword, you can still do things like half-swording I mentioned earlier, grabbing a blade about halfway up. I'd recommend wearing gloves or something, because if it's your first time, you might accidentally cut your hand, which is not recommended. But, when you're using a one-handed sword or two-handed sword, you will still sometimes struggle with accuracy. I can remember one Swords and Cider, speaking of the same event that I saw this comment on. I did actually have a time when I had a spear. It wasn't a sword, but point still applies. Well, point. I was trying to thrust, so I had the spear, and bearing in mind I was, up against a large bottle. I think it was one of those pop bottles, you know, the 2-litre bottles. And I was using that against a spear. So I had an ample opportunity to go and thrust. It was a still target, you know, it's not fighting back, it's not moving, it's not some kind of special swinging target or anything. So you think, ah, great, I wonder what kind of amazing stab you did there, Jonathan. Well, I missed, and I stabbed the tree trunk underneath it. Yeah, that was an embarrassing moment. But that's because the length of the weapon, I was not very accurate with thrusting at the time. So yeah, I stabbed a tree trunk instead of the actual intended target. So hence, the longer the blade, the worse your accuracy will suffer, unfortunately. Even though the results can be more fun because you run through and you're sliding all the way up about 40 inches. Whoa! Sorry, that looked dangerously close to a Nazi salute. That slid through about 40, you know, sliding through about 40 inches of blade, or something like a spear stave, or similar sort of thing. Quite fun. And you've got more for it to run through the target, even though it's a bit more of a job to extract afterwards. Now, that accuracy, it tends to be a minor factor. But apart from that, I tend to see more one-handed weapons in general sort of internet videos, with the exclusion of katanas, because when you've got weeaboos and katanas, you know, they start to orgasm over their Nippon steel and all that. But typically, a lot of these tend to be one-handed weapons, and that's simply because just like when you're operating the just like when you're operating these sorts of weapons in real life, if you were thinking like a battlefield, carrying a one-handed sword around is more of a task. Sorry, it's less of a task than carrying a two-handed sword around. The larger and heavier your object, the more difficult it is to carry around. And just like when you were looking at things like the battlefield or travelling around town, that sort of thing can apply to modern test cutting as well. If you've got something like a one-handed sword in its sheath or scabbard, it's easier to carry to and from your test cutting, because test cutting is, you know, a whole thing. You're not teleported there. You're physically carrying them from wherever you are to wherever it is. So having a sword on your waist, carried conveniently, or just carrying it by hand, sort of on your shoulder, takes up less room and is more convenient when it's a one-handed sword compared to a two-handed sword. Even the longer ones, which have something like a 32, 34-inch cavalry blade, it tends to be a better experience just carrying a one-handed sword around. Like, here we are. So here I've got my Langsax. In fact, I will return shortly. I actually have a sword that I made with its scabbard. So that's a Langsax. So this one's a little bit shorter because it is a 20 or 20, I think, no, it's a 20-inch blade, not 21-inch, I think. Yeah, I'm working on backwards motions. Right, here we are. So with this, it's a more convenient carrying system. Now, if I took something like this two-handed sword and I was trying to carry that around in a sheath, carrying it to and from test cutting is a bit of a task, because it's going to be sticking out and whack. I can just almost whack the screen. In fact, here we are, up to the hilt. Almost whack the screen and the microphone from here. And carrying that sort of thing all around, you can imagine how annoying the inconvenience is. And even if you're... There we are, case in point, carrying it around on your shoulders, I'm nearly hitting the light fitting. Whereas, if I grab a nice, tasty, one-handed sword... Ah! Now, where were we? Nice and convenient. So, yes, it might seem like a more boring factor to consider, but when you are the one holding a weapon, and perhaps one day you will be, it's more convenient carrying it around like this, a one-handed blade. So, overall, I suppose it varies. I suppose that's like a classic scholar's answer, isn't it? Which is better for test cutting? Which is more enjoyable to use? A one-handed sword or a two-handed sword? It depends. That's your too long didn't read. It depends. Or, wait, is it two-handed sword better? Sometimes. That's the way the cookie crumbles. So yes, I hope that was interesting to you, and this is an unusual format of video I probably won't do very often, so you can tell me what you thought about it. Oh, and let's see if I can coordinate myself. It's this direction, yes. So, yes, as per the thing, if you've got video requests and things, it'd be good to have them. I know it says make wishes. Obviously don't ask me to, like, make you a millionaire or something. It's not going to happen, but video requests on these sorts of topics I will certainly do. And I actually do have a wish that I'm going to be granting soon. I'm doing my research, which is... yeah, there's some degree of stuff like the... looking at model 1860 like cavalry saber, which someone wanted me to do. So, but I didn't want to do a video yet because I'm still researching. I didn't want to just burp out nonsense. Whereas this is something I'm confident about. I've done test cutting. You know, I've done that many times over multiple years. I've made blades, I've cut things with the blades, I've been to events where they do test cutting, I've done it at home, all sorts of stuff, and I've probably, if I can be asked to do editing, I've probably shown you some in this video already. So yes, I hope that was interesting, and you can comment your wishes and maybe include the number 57 in your comment to let me know that you watched all the way to the end, and I shall see you in the next video. Goodbye.